Dr. Cline, would you like to present your
like me
testimony?
to speak?
And then we'll have questions.
Okay. Chairman Sweeney, Chairman Gottfried, distinguished members of the legislature. The Independent Oil and Gas Association appreciates this opportunity to share our perspectives on the health impacts of hydraulic fracturing of natural gas wells. My name is Scott Cline. I hold a bachelor's degree in geological science from Penn State, both master's and PhD in petroleum engineering from the University of Oklahoma. I began my career in 1976 as a geophysicist for Gulf Oil, which is now part of Chevron, and then worked for over 25 years in the oil and gas industry as geophysicist, geologist, petroleum engineer, and later as senior manager at several oil and gas companies based in Houston and Oklahoma City. I currently reside in the Finger Lakes region of New York. I was extensively involved in the early implementation and development of horizontal drilling, especially in Oklahoma, and my research interests and publications primarily concentrate on horizontal drilling in naturally fractured reservoirs, fluid flow and porous media reservoir simulation, and oil and gas reserve analysis. Most recently, I served as subject matter expert for at the EPA hearings in Arlington, Virginia on well construction, hydraulic fracturing, and fluid flow and porous media, and I also helped the Quebec's Office of Public Hearings on the Environment in helping them to design regulations similar to what we're doing here in New York. Neither fracture stimulation nor the production of produced water back to the surface through the wellbore poses a risk of fluid migration to sources of underground drinking water. There is some risk of exposure pathway in case of large surface spills that are not contained to the lined drilling pad, but not from the subsurface operations. The fracture-stimulated production zone is typically a mile or more below the underground source of drinking water, which I'll refer to as USDW for brevity. Approximately 30 plus or minus 10% of the fracture fluids are recovered over the life of the well and directed per proposed regulations in New York into tanks at the surface. Within the first few weeks to months following fracture stimulation, the remaining 70% plus or minus 10% of the fluid is imbibed into the large surface area of the fractures and locked effectively into place with the native brine by capillary forces for geologic time. Even if that fluid could move within the subsurface, which it cannot, the fluid is separated from the USDW by thousands of feet of numerous impermeable layers of strata, and neither a permeability path nor a pressure gradient to move it exists. Permeability, sustained pressure gradient, and the availability of fluid are all required or fluids will not move in the subsurface. The fracture stimulation, which lasts only a matter of hours to days for each fracture stage, after which the pressure gradient is reversed and flow to the wellbore begins. The wellbore thus becomes a pressure sink, the lowest pressure point, and any available gas and fluids then move to that pressure sink and up to the surface through the wellbore that has triple or often quadruple redundant layers of steel casing and cement plus tubing to protect the USDW. The naturally occurring Marcellus fracture joints that were created naturally millions of years ago during the gas generation phase do not extend above the Marcellus. The Marcellus is in essence both the source and reservoir in a closed petroleum system. Over time, even these natural fractures became partially mineralized and disconnected. The object of the fracture stimulation is thus to reconnect them, thus allowing the gas to flow to the wellbore more effectively. When these natural fractures are subsequently hydraulic fracture stimulated in horizontal wells, the wells typically, as I mentioned, exhibit good gas production but poor fluid recovery. The relative contributions to fluid entrapment are fluid leak off into the fracture face. I supplied a white paper to you as a secondary aid that has some visual aids in here that might be useful in visualizing this that I presented at the EPA hearings. Additionally, adsorption of water to the hydrophilic clays. The clays material in the shale wants to capture some of that water. Narrow fracture branches also trap the fluid by stranding and capillary forces, and fluid also drops to the bottom of the propped packs by gravity, and the gas flows preferentially above it. In addition to fluid retention mechanisms, the fracture pressures, which could potentially drive fluid from the target shale formation toward an aquifer, are only applied, as I mentioned, for a short period of time, after which flow is reversed. Even if the water was not trapped and could be moved, the developable shale formations, separated by thousands of feet of impermeable laminated strata, would require decades, if not centuries, to move that water to the surface. Instead, the formation experiences continually decreasing well pressure during production, and eventually there's no energy even available to move fluid through the low permeability shale, and not even to the well itself eventually. Even though gas production is directed to the wellbore during production, it's certainly prudent to examine the potential height of fractures that are created by hydraulic fracturing. While the mechanisms that limit the vertical fracture height have been widely discussed, investigated, observed in laboratory and field testing, direct evidence is also available showing the limited extent of vertical fracture propagation. This is done through microseismic monitoring and testing, which gives us essentially a subsurface picture of the height of the fracture stimulation. This was recently illustrated in the literature, where an extensive microseismic database in the Marcellus Formation, and also one was done in the Barnett, showed the vertical separation between the highest vertical extent of the created fractures to the shallow groundwater sources, indicating that fracture stimulation was not creating fractures anywhere near, thousands of feet still separating the stimulated zone from the groundwater. I provided that in my additional paper here too. In fact, in addition to this, vertical fracture propagation at depths of less than 3,000 feet is not even possible, as natural in situ stress fields tend to rotate the fracture propagation from vertical to horizontal at depths less than 3,000 feet. In other words, the fractures begin to rotate horizontally, they cannot be created vertically, and they go along the bedding planes. In addition to that, DEC regulations, as proposed, do not allow high-volume fracture stimulations at depths less than 2,000 feet without site-specific review. In any event, induced fractures do not extend far above the target zone, and the injected water that does not return to the surface through production is trapped by the combination of capillary, geomechanical proppant, stranding, and absorption mechanisms, which render most of the injected water immobile. Thus, once the stimulation pressures, lasting, as I mentioned, only a matter of hours, are released, fluid flow is directed to the wellbore and up to the surface through the production string. The purpose of the well casing design is to effectively hydraulically isolate the deeply buried producing formations from the near surface. This is accomplished through a redundant triple to quadruple system of overlapping steel casings cemented entirely to the surface. New York's regulations require cementing the casing all the way to the surface. The perforations at the very bottom of the wellbore, where the gas is entering the wellbore, is the only pathway for the fluid and the migration of the gas. It wants to find the lowest pressure path to the surface. It's not going to go around the casing, even if there was a crack in the cement, which there would not be because we tested both mechanically and through sonic log testing. It would still preferentially want to go up that center string of casing where the perforations have exposed the formation. There is no basic difference in well construction actually between vertical and horizontal wells. After drilling over 1 million onshore wells in the U.S., there are still no confirmed cases of groundwater contamination from hydraulic fracture in the producing zone. It is true that methane has migrated into groundwater sources occasionally. However, it is important to note that it is not from the stimulated zones of the shales, the target zones. The methane, but is rather a result of near-surface sources of methane naturally occurring that are in close proximity to the groundwater sources. This statement is also well confirmed by the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania, that confirmed that the methane that was found in the wells at Dimmock was not coming from the Marcellus. These incidents can be prevented and necessarily remediated with existing technologies and a good knowledge of the shallow geologic conditions. In fact, proposed New York regulations would have mitigated these publicized events. In summary, the water that remains in the formation is trapped effectively for geologic time with no mechanism to move from the deeply buried formations. The gas and fluids that do not remain trapped in the formation flow to the wellbore pressure sink and safely to production facilities at the surface. The surface is where the attention to preventing spills and processing water should be concentrated, and I'm confident that current industry best practices, existing technology, and DEC regulations will ensure that this happens. The Independent Oil and Gas Association of New York appreciates this opportunity to share our thoughts, as well as myself, and I truly believe that we can balance the interests of the environment with the ability to safely develop these resources in New York. Thank you.